Alright, so in this video we're going to talk about Oladipo Agboluaje's play The Estate. So, Agboluaje is a British writer of Nigerian descent. This is a play set entirely in Nigeria, and that's kind of an interesting choice because Agboluaje is part of a sort of post-colonial generation of writers. So, post-colonial authors, people like Wole Soyinka, Femi Osofisan, Chinua Achebe, people like this, the big canonical names of African literature, for instance, or Indian literature. We get similar things. Caribbean literature, similar things as well. The sort of canonical names of post-colonial writing, conflict within these stories tend to really center on the metropolitan versus the colonial. And what I mean by that essentially is the imperial power versus the colonized space and or peoples. So colonialism is the dominant conflict in many of these pieces. Agboluaje is part of a newer generation where their sort of primary life experience, whether that's in Nigeria, where Agboluaje's roots are from, or in the African diaspora in Britain, for instance, or in the United States, or Canada, Australia, France, wherever it is. This newer generation of writers is their primary life experience has not been shaped by the experience of colonialism or the immediate struggle against colonialism. And so they tend to have a somewhat more I don't want to say self-focused lens because that sounds selfish, but contemporary Nigerian writers, for instance, are much better equipped in many cases to focus on the internal problems of Nigeria and how Nigeria itself and the Nigerian government, Nigerian society, Nigerian traditions, etc., creates conflict, rather than saying, oh, the British are the source of conflict. And so The Estate is definitely in this category of plays. It is, again, set in Nigeria, and it takes a critical lens to the socio-cultural issues that exist in Nigeria. So, this play is set shortly after the death of Chief Adeyemi. He was a businessman. He was patriarch of this family. He was a landowner. He owned factories, massive amount of wealth, etc., supposedly. We'll get back to that. We have three sections to this play. We have the wake, we have the funeral, and then we have the Thanksgiving. These are, as I understand it, sort of traditional elements of Nigerian or Yoruba funeral practices. Three different sort of phases of this. Over the course of this, there is a lot of conflict along different matrices, or different sort of levels of conflict. One of the key conflicts is between Yinka Adeyemi and Helen Adeyemi. Yinka is the oldest son of the chief's first wife, Hoyen, and Helen is the second wife. Helen believes that because she was the chief's wife, she should have a good amount of say over what happens with the estate. Yinka, because he's the oldest son of the first wife, and because he has always resented Helen, and as we learned later in the play, they had had a sexual relationship prior to Helen taking up with his father. Yinka detests Helen and feels that he should be pretty much, he and his brother Soji should be pretty much the only ones who get any of the inheritance, any of the estate, etc., etc. There's also Sola, who's Helen's daughter. She resents her mother. She's not... What exactly the source of that conflict isn't entirely clear, but it does seem like a lot of it stems from Helen not protecting Sola from, not physical abuse necessarily in a Nigerian context. In the U.S. context, we would probably call it physical abuse by Chief Adeyemo. But she does recount that he beat her severely. Helen sent Sola off to boarding school to sort of, in Sola's view, to get her out of the way, etc., etc. So there's that resentment. And a lot of this conflict within the Adeyemo family really revolves around money and inheritance. And we actually kind of see this. We see some of these financial issues crop up almost from the beginning of the play, because Helen is buying new clothes. So she's going through the sort of catalogs of these social registers, something like this. The name of it is Ovation, and I don't know what that actually is, but it seems like a sort of like announcements of major local events among the elites or something like this. And she sees that the cloth, the design that they had previously agreed on for the funeral clothes was worn by a different family recently, and so she decides to have new garments made for the whole family. And she has one made for the wake, one made for the funeral, one made for the first half of the party, one made for the second half of the party. So this is 4 sets of new clothes that she wants made in a day for the 4 members of this family: herself, Yinka, Soji, and Sola. But we also get the first inkling that cash may not be quite as readily available as one would want. Because Abasina, who's the housemaid, says that the driver can't drive anywhere, basically. And then Mr. Ikong comes in, who's the driver, and he says, Ikong, what's his job? Yeah, he's the driver. I thought he was. But he says, "Hey, madam, Alhaji say no money, no diesel." Helen says, "And it's just now you're telling me?" Ikong says, "Madam, you say I should bring the drinks inside." Helen says, "You told Alhaji that I say I will pay him later?" Ikong says, "I tell him, madam. He say you never pay him for the last diesel." So this is where we start to get this sense that maybe this is actually a family that's spending beyond their means in some way. And this, at the end of the play, is what we find out. That seemingly at Helen's request, Chief Adeyemo has sort of written her blank checks, more or less. And the money from the estate is largely gone. They're financed by debt, etc., etc. We learned that the factories that are owned by the Adeyemos have been out of operation for about 5 years. Their mansion in London has been sold off. And basically they are not even bankrupt, because bankrupt suggests having nothing. They are well in debt. So you have that issue, and all of these sort of financial concerns related to the elites in Nigeria, and the ways in which money is often spent by I'm going to say post-colonial elites, though again, I don't know that this is a post-colonial commentary specifically. But the way that money is often spent by elites in countries like Nigeria, where social status is very, very important, and where there are traditions starting, or not, I don't want to say traditions, but where there are common practices starting from corrupt governments going down through the sort of social hierarchy. And this is not exclusive to Nigeria. I don't want to sort of suggest that this is also true. Like, I actually think this play has a lot in common with Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard, where the family who owns the property in that play had spent well beyond their means. This was a very common issue in Britain as well. This is part of the reason why so many great houses are now owned by public trusts and things like this, is because when you have this social system in which there are elites who have to maintain their position, often that involves extravagant spending that can't really be funded by the actual cash on hand or the resources available to them. So while you have those conflicts, the sort of large-scale financial conflicts going on, you also have other conflicts within this society, particularly social class conflicts and gender roles. The servants play a big role in this, and there's a few principal servants. There's Abisina, who's the house girl, Ikong, who's the driver, and Afolabi, who's the caretaker. And Afolabi is this like very old guy who's been with them forever. He's devoted his life to this family, etc., etc. He's kind of like the old servant who dies at the end of the cherry orchard. Abasina and Ikong are younger. Abasina is much, much younger. Ikong, it seems like, is kind of middle-aged, like he's been around for a bit, he's been working for them for a bit, but he supports workers' rights in the sort of classic sense of building unions, going on strike, this sort of socialist-y inflected rhetoric of the exploitation of the working class, etc., etc. Abasina is more cautious about this because she doesn't want to rock the boat, she doesn't want to lose her place, etc., etc. And so you've got those elements going on. There's also a number of elements in terms of gender roles here. Abasina is repeatedly told by a couple of different people, hey, you know what? You can improve your social position by just seducing a rich guy, which she kind of did, because we find out toward the end that she's carrying Chief Adeyema's baby. Unfortunately, he is now dead, and the family doesn't have any money. Abasina was also having an affair with Yinka, the oldest son, but he's going to lose a lot of his wealth and status in a divorce because he was having affairs, and his African-American wife did not approve of that, understandably so, because in the US it's a different sort of social system than in Nigeria, a different gendered system than in Nigeria. Sola is in a similar kind of weird position where she is somewhat she's repeatedly told to depend on a man, and yet she is a student. She's earning a degree. She is dedicated to being able to support herself rather than relying on a man. And so all of these things sort of create conflict both with her mother and with Soji, who's sympathetic and potentially attracted to her, even though she's his half sister. So she is trying to get out of Nigeria. She's trying to get to London. Soji's kind of like on the fence about whether or not he wants to help her because he's supposedly a professor in London, but we actually find out his position is not secure. And so there are all those issues as well. And this sort of raises questions about the experience of Africans going abroad to work, or people from the global south going to the global north and trying to find positions, and often being sort of disappointed, which is a similar sort of theme to what we had in Agboluaje's play Early Morning, which I talked about in a previous video. So you've got all of these sort of swirling social conflicts and tensions and things like this that that crisscross the estate as a play. And again, it's this interesting sort of analysis slash taking apart of contemporary Nigerian society, identifying problems within that society itself, rather than sort of pushing those problems off onto Britain and colonialism.